welcome everybody. This is Capitalism and Catastrophe, Profits, Pandemics and Climate Chaos. We've obviously got, as people are aware, we've got parallel panels running, and indeed we're trying to deal with a number of issues, as many as we can, if you like, that are of relevance over the weekend. Some things, of course, will be more theoretical than others. Other things will be about very specific struggles. In a sense, this meeting is one of the ones that I suppose is at you know, to use a slightly hackneyed phrase, almost at a macro level, in the sense that it's about, you know, perhaps the existential issues facing us today, and particularly in the last couple of years of obviously COVID times and so on and so forth. The usual format, each speaker will speak for around 12 minutes or so, give or take. We'll then open it up to the floor. Please raise your hand, the yellow hand, if you can, in order to ask a question. You can also, of course, post questions in the chat if you prefer. I would ask, obviously up to you, to if we can, try and sort of reduce the amount of parallel conversations going on in the chat. I think the chat is very useful and I think it's great, but I think it can be sometimes a little off-putting. This point was made by previous someone in the previous panel, if there is a lot of separate discussions going on. So maybe try and use it more for asking questions for the panel. I think that would be great. Okay, let me introduce the speakers. We're going to have Faizi first, Faizi Ismail, who is a member of Counterfire activist and teaches global policy and activism at Goldsmiths, University of London, trade unionist as well, and currently serving as co-secretary of the UCU branch there. After Faizi, we're going to have Kevin Ovenden, who is a Counterfire member, also writer and activist, and was author of the first English language book on Syriza. So, okay, over to you, Faizi.
Thank you, Martin. So I think it's fair to say that we are now entering a period of such profound crisis, such a complex of multiple and overlapping deep and systemic global crises, that something has to change. So change is coming. But of course, there are at least two different directions that change can happen. And I want to focus on this point in relation to the climate question. Either we continue down the capitalist road towards collapse, increasing exploitation of both labor and nature, which is now spelling the rapid breakdown of planetary life and ultimately human civilization, or we abandon production for profit and focus on utilizing our natural resources to attend to need for everybody on the planet on the basis of equality and solidarity. So never was Luxemburg's warning so apposite. It is socialism or barbarism. The fact is, world leaders have made no progress since Glasgow and the COP26 conference that was supposed to be the most important climate conference ever. They are doing exactly the opposite of what needs to be done. The mainstream media reports that the biggest oil companies are on track to spend over $100 million a day for the next 10 years exploiting new oil and gas projects. So it's an extraordinary situation in that we're hurtling towards the abyss, and the people in power act as if they have everything under control. They are not in control, but they do have power. The problem here is that the ruling class is not capable of solving any of the major crises we faced, and that is because of competition. The oil and gas giants have to continue to invest and compete, right? They have to do that, else they will go out of business. And as long as there are resources to extract, the profit motive means that they have to be extracted. Compare this logic to Greta Thunberg's logic, which is exactly the opposite. She says, if the emissions must stop, then we must stop the emissions, right? This is impossible for the tiny minority who holds power. You know, these are two directly opposite things. And the short-termism, for the sake of profit, for that tiny minority, will result, unless we stop it, in what Marx called in the opening of the Communist Manifesto, the common ruin of the contending classes. And of course, much of the liberal intelligentsia fails to challenge this profit motive by buying into the idea that it's up to our individual consumer choices, that by making tweaks to our lifestyles, buying local and organic and calculating our carbon footprints and not flying and so on, we can reverse the damage. Now, this idea has been around for a very long time, but consumer sovereignty is, firstly, I think, a myth that relies on the notion that demand drives supply, and secondly, that power lies in the hands of consumers exercising consumer choice. I think the reality is that the opposite is true. Production is based on what is profitable. It works to constrain consumer choices, and it gives power to those who control it. And moreover, the supposed choices related to our lifestyles are fundamentally about social reproduction and therefore necessities. But even what is necessary is constrained by income and what we can afford. So although, okay, we can change certain things to do with the way we live, we have to understand that this is absolutely not where the solution lies, because we have to consider what is possible for the vast majority of people in society, what is possible for working class people to do. Most people don't have choices when it comes to lifestyle, or their choices are so limited that it makes no sense to focus on an aggregate of individual changes. The solution has to match the scale of the crisis. For example, if we're to move to a new and genuinely sustainable energy infrastructure, a major electricity grid or massive solar and wind power capability, it has to be on the scale that is required in order that there becomes no competing alternative that is more profitable. But to achieve scale, it needs to be at a national level and ultimately the global level, but it also needs to be directed by government. This effectively means that market forces can play little or no role in an alternative energy system. First, because there just has to be massive investment without necessarily a return on those investments in terms of profit. And secondly, it has to be a nationalized monopoly. And we can do this under something like a Green New Deal. It's totally possible to do it, to go that far, at least under the capitalist system. But this in itself, of course, ultimately won't be enough, because although moving towards such a scenario is necessary, it doesn't challenge the production process, and it doesn't challenge relations of production, right? Production has to be the central question: how things are produced and who produces them. Production can no longer continue to be controlled by a tiny minority in society. It has to be democratic if we are to begin to reverse the climate crisis. Now, we have to ask, what does democratic control of production mean in concrete terms? Well, it means nothing other than gaining collective control over how we produce the things that we need and ridding the entire process of market forces, overcoming the alienation that we face in that process. Now, all of this can seem overwhelming given the particularly systemic nature of the climate crisis, the staggering scale of what is at stake. And I think this is certainly one of the reasons why the climate movement has taken so long to break through into the mainstream. It's the powerlessness that people feel when instincts tell them that actually lifestyle changes aren't going to make the difference that is required. But it's not that struggles, as we said in the previous meeting, it's not that struggles aren't taking place. We are seeing a slow but solid uptake in working class struggle in terms of strikes, strong movements against war, against the cost of living, against racism, sexism, and so on. So I think the way to respond to the climate crisis then is by integrating the question of the climate into the various movements. It's heartening that climate activists have joined the RMT picket lines and they're arguing that, you can't separate the climate crisis from the cost of living crisis. One activist said that, the only way workers can fight for a fair low carbon transition is by building union strength and the power of collective bargaining. And that's absolutely right. So this has to be part and parcel of all of our movements. And it also means getting the politics right. So, for example, on the issue of the war in Ukraine, the government in this country is arguing that Putin is forcing them to source more oil and gas from British waters, and they make no apology for it. So far from being an opportunity to invest in clean energy, our warmongers are arguing that either we source what we need from the North Sea or import more from abroad. Meanwhile, they have spent well over £1 billion on weapons in the war in Ukraine. Now, in this multipolar world, we're moving towards increasing confrontation, inter-imperialist rivalry, sharper competition, and where war is integral to the capitalist system. We have to reject that. We have to say, we reject more arms spending and further militarization. You know, this is what is absorbing the energies of the ruling class. So it's not going to come from the ruling class. It is going to come from the streets. It's going to come from below. It's going to come from the mass movements. And as I say, you know, getting our political positions right on a number of issues that aren't necessarily about the climate crisis per se is extremely important. Our view of the war and so on. You can't just be a climate activist anymore. You've got to have, you know, political positions on how we change society. You know, and I think at that level, people feel like they can change things in their immediate you know, environment and their immediate struggles. So we can't separate our analysis of the different issues. On the contrary, we've got to link them together. And this requires a collective approach, right? Building the biggest mass social movements that we can, right? Against austerity, as I say, against war, against the climate, against racism and sexism and so on, combined with industrial struggle that focuses on where power lies, which is who controls the point of production. And I think it's this combination, which we were beginning to see, you know, in COP26, when you know, Greta Thunberg and others called on the striking bin workers to join the demonstrations in you know, at COP26 against world leaders in you know, against the climate crisis. I think this kind of you know, confluence, this combination, I think is what we need to see. We can't see these struggles as separate. We absolutely have to start working together, and that requires, you know, both an analysis, but also a strategy, a sort of concrete strategy that starts to you know, enable us to actually work together in concrete terms in all of these struggles.
Thank you, Feja. That's a fantastic introduction to what's such an important discussion. There are people clapping on screen, as I'm sure you can see, so that's always good to see. Before I hand over to Kevin, I think, you know, what you were saying about the climate activists and the trade union movement is so important. I mean, XR Trade Unions is such a positive step. Yesterday at the RMT Solidarity Rally in Manchester, there was an XR Trade Unionist speaker, and there was a significant proportion of climate activists on that demo, and in a way that I think there may not have been a few years ago at what was essentially a strike solidarity rally. I think this is a really important step. Okay, enough from me. I'm going to hand over now to Kevin, who I've already introduced. So over to you, Kevin. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Martin. I think we're at a major world historic turning point, and in all sorts of respects. And to grasp it, I want to go back and take our minds back very quickly, 25 years ago, when we were told at that time that we were also in a world historic turning point. But then the message was the old rival to Western capitalism, the USSR, had collapsed, that the world was globalizing, the Western model of capitalism was triumphing everywhere, that the more it spread, the more what were referred to as historic hangovers or problems would be solved by the movement of capitalism itself, by this ever-expanding growth and globalization. Problems such as El Salvador, apartheid in South Africa, Palestine, Ireland, these historic questions would be resolved through the spread of Amazon, Starbucks, McDonald's, and what have you. Further, that the threat of war, any war, was receding. Where war did take place, it was outside of the system in the kind of uncivilized, not yet globalized part of the system. This is what was said. I know it sounds fantastical now, but this is what was said. And further, on all of the questions of social rights, the rights of women, the rights of gay, LGBT people, anti-racism, again, that the very dynamic of capitalism would undermine what was regarded as a hangover from the past, not something, not things which were deeply embedded systemically. And similarly on the environment, there was environmental consciousness in 1997, and the idea of green capitalism was already being born. Now look at the last 20 years, 22 years. The war on terror, prior to that, other wars, the financial crisis of 2008, the outflow of the financial crisis intersecting with the war on terror in terms of the eruption of revolutionary developments across the Arab region, mass starvation in parts of the world, food riots in 2011, the breakdown of the established, what Tariq Ali calls the extreme centre, the centre-left and centre-right parties, the Democrats and the Republicans in the US, Labour and Tories. The breakdown of these in the mid-2010s is referred to by those who were the main defenders of the system as this age of populism, that the rational, technocratic liberal centre was besieged by irrational, angry populists. It had a left face, it had a right face, but that didn't really matter because underlying it, it was the same thing. This was the argument. Then apparently we were to be past the age of populism because Trump lost in the United States and Emmanuel Macron won in France. But what comes then? We have the COVID crisis, the pandemic. We have immediately after that the eruption of the war over Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. Now, it shouldn't really matter that, certainly to us, it shouldn't matter morally that this is a war in Europe. I hate this stuff. War has returned to Europe as if down where I live, there hadn't been war in the Balkans in the 1990s, and as if the ongoing wars in the Great Lakes region of Africa, which have killed millions of people, don't really matter because they're not in Europe, they're not blonde-haired, and they're not the refugees that we say that we welcome. But it is significant to the system that this war has now entered, that the succession of wars, which have never gone away over the last 20 years, has now cascaded into the European, Eurasian landmass. And the importance of all of this is that I think we're seeing literally catastrophe. And it's a catastrophe which flows all the way down to everyday life. In Sri Lanka today, it's reported that the country has run out of fuel, because it can't pay the debts to the international financial system and so on. In Tunisia, there are demonstrations over the price of bread. I'm convinced that they will spread all over North Africa, all over the Maghreb. These were the kind of things which gave rise to the Tunisian revolution and the overthrow of Mubarak in 2011. 72% of Sylhet, large province, large region of Bangladesh, is underwater, and on it goes. So we're not talking about catastrophes in the future. We're not talking about these prognostications that we get from the official conferences about what might happen when. It's a reality now. And it is climate catastrophe, war, and economic breakdown. The economic breakdown is not simply the ups and downs, the boom and slump cycle that we know capitalism produces, but it's the breakdown of the whole model of globalization, that by outsourcing logistics, outsourcing workers, that you could reduce the costs and increase the profits. The crisis over COVID, the social crisis, the pandemic, revealed a lot of the weaknesses in that model of capitalism, and also within capitalism itself, but in that model of capitalism. So when Faizi said things will have to change, that's absolutely right. And I think even capitalists say things will have to change. The question is what kind of change, and that's what I want to spend just the last 5 minutes on, because to say that things are breaking down and therefore we need action doesn't mean that we will automatically get the radical action and the right kinds of answers. Just to give you an example, the capitalist system broke down in the early 1930s to the greatest extent that it had done up to that point. It didn't mean that as even ruling classes or parts of them or political forces looked to a new model of organizing things, that it was necessarily progressive. We had fascism in one country and after another in Europe. It was not automatic that we had fascism. Fascism came to power in a battle against a progressive, in fact, against a socialist alternative, but there was no automaticity in the situation. And now there's no automaticity either. The German government, very nice, left of centre government, social democratic, green, and free market liberals who are actually right of centre, but forget about them, outlined an ambitious programme, it was called, for net zero, whatever it was, 2030, 2040, doesn't matter. What happens as soon as you have the Ukraine war? In order to insulate themselves geopolitically from the political influence of Russian gas, they reopen coal mines and turn to burning the worst fossil fuel that you can imagine. And it's not just them, it's happening all over the place and in one area of the crisis after another. So what do we learn over the pandemic? We learn that we need to invest now in a free and public way, or freely available and public way, internationally, to produce vaccines, retrovirals, to deal with the looming problem, which will hit within possibly months of bacterial, resistant bacteria. And then what happens instead? More money is pumped into the competing pharmaceutical companies. So we can't rely on something automatically happening like that. Very finally, I don't think we can rely upon there being this reflecting itself within the existing political system. I mean, people, I just mentioned the German government, but if you look at Labour as a potential alternative government, it's not talking remotely in these terms. It's not looking at an existential crisis, and now being the moment to make a radical shift in the way that we organise everything from food production and distribution, which would be relatively easy to do in Britain, technically, because 80% of food is sold through the four big supermarket chains. If you took over them, you could ensure a basic standard of food, which already we know people don't have. And the social crisis that's unfolding now, even in a developed country like Britain, I think most people have little idea what it's going to look like in 6 or 8 months' time in the winter, when people literally cannot afford food. Not that they go down to the value, whatever, or they skip a meal, but they cannot afford food and they can't afford heating. And in that situation, there's going to be, and already is, a huge political polarization. We saw this in France at the recent election. France was supposed to be the place where there was a restoration of liberal capitalism, a little bit of green speak, a little bit of acknowledging the rights of minorities and so on. That's what Macron was supposed to represent in 2017. 5 years later, Macron falling down, he won the election, the presidential election, lost control of the National Assembly, a big increase for the representation of the fascists, but also a big increase in the representation and in the vote, crucially, of the radical left. And so I think that now is the time that's world historic. There's no going back to just trying to change things through conventional politics, whether that's parliamentary or even conventional campaigning and conventional trade unionism. We want more people active, even if it's in your average strike like the traffic wardens in Wiltshire. Good on them, but we have to bind things together, pull things together to try to build a counterforce on a much, much bigger scale, because it's not just that we have one crisis and we have to deal with that and another. It's a crisis upon a crisis upon a crisis, and each one, the answer to each one that we're given, deepens the next crisis. That's what happened in 2008. We will bail out the banks. They bailed out the banks, and then we had a decade of austerity. Now we've had COVID and the pandemic, a big state intervention. So this isn't really about whether the state intervenes or not. The state has intervened massively, but massively in order to create more billionaires in Britain and to increase the wealth of the 1%. So it really raises that question as well. Not just what should states do, what should public authorities do, but who controls that? And there, I think that the question of radical democracy, of the power of workers in the workplace and across the society is crucial, whether it is in your area, stopping an addiction, or whether it's globally and stopping destruction of life on the planet.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Thank you. Such important issues being discussed here, and I think it's so useful to hear, if you like, the issues facing us at that level over a longer period set out with such clarity. I mean, you're absolutely right to point out that we were all we were sold a lie that we'd moved into a unipolar world, hadn't we? Because obviously of US hegemony and the idea that liberal capitalism was going to solve all these problems. And it was falling apart at the time it was being sold as an idea, but we've seen it absolutely erupt in this century, it seems to me.